Welcome, everyone. We are so excited here today. Hello, we are here with Eric Hunley of the Unstructured podcast, and we're going to be speaking about how to book celebrity guests, how to book those high profile on your podcast. So I'm Norma Jean Belenky. I'm the head of events here at Podbean. I'm going to read our brief intro, and then we will jump in and get started. So welcome, everyone, to Podcasting Smarter and our August live event, a celebrity on your podcast with Eric Hunley, the host and creator of these. We talk about guest bookings and how to get those high value guests. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions like this one with top podcast experts. We also have exclusive recorded episodes of Podcasting Smarter podcast. We're brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 600 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. And now let's get started and jump in.
Hey, good to be here. How are you?
Pretty good. So first off, tell us a little bit about Unstructured and ask for everyone out there who hasn't had a chance to have it here in the show notes. It's such a unique show and really so specific to your niche with birds and that kind of thing. So tell us a little bit.
It's ironic because in a weird way, it's not niched at all, but it is. It is and it's not. It's hard to say. I kind of follow my own interests, and over time things evolve. But essentially, it's spun out of being a fan of other shows like Joe Rogan back in the day, which introduced me to another show called Mixed Mental Arts, which has gone by the wayside. But on there, they were talking to all these really cool, amazing authors. And I'm interested in that kind of stuff like Freakonomics, Malcolm Gladwell, and different books. And so I was jealous of them and said, oh, well, you know what? I want to talk to, really cool authors myself and just interesting people with the theme of, I almost called it Idea Pub, but the idea essentially was that if you were to walk into a pub and sit down at a table, I'd be at the next table talking to somebody, and you just hear me, meet this person and be like, wait a minute, you do what? And that's sort of the theme. It's like, you are what, or you do what, wow, that's amazing. So that's essentially it. It sounds very vague.
Yeah. You wish that you overheard part of, or that you feel bad maybe about something that kind of sparks your excitement is something you actually should be listening to because you're invited. So that's fantastic. And I mean, let's get into the guests, because you've had some really high profile guests, FBI negotiators, governmental personnel, best-selling authors, like you were mentioning, and also, Carol Baskin from Tiger, Dr. Drew. You've had quite a few well-known guests. So in terms of guests, I mean, obviously within Unstructured, you're interested in. I think that's the most important thing, right? People that you have it, you're excited about. So I think that's such an important aspect of guest selection. And in terms of reach and impact, us who are experts or who've gained notoriety.
It's funny. You pointed out something that's really important, and the guest has to be inspiring to me, and even more importantly, to the audience. And it's an ironic situation, but believe it or not, Dr. Drew's not one of my better performers, nor is David Rubin. No, so just because a guest is a name doesn't necessarily mean that they fit as perfectly with your audience. I've actually found that some of my great performing episodes are just highly impactful episodes and conversations with people. Like Jim Clemente is actually a high profile person, I guess. He did Criminal Minds, was FBI, and things like that. But the interview with him was good enough and unique enough that they included in his Wikipedia article to talk about, what he went through with 9/11 and almost dying on the table and things like that. But that is a powerful interview because we just shared this really cool moment. Other people,
Yeah.
you can go after a name and it's like, okay, well, you've got the name. How many podcasts have they been on? If they're
Right.
everywhere, and I'm not going to name names, but there are podcasters out there who are very big podcasters who have been on every freaking podcast ever.
Yeah.
And word to the wise, if people want to see them, and this is part of what I think happens with like Dr. Drew or Dave Rubin or whatever. Dr. Drew has a show. He has multiple shows. So do people need to seek him out to see him on my show? Or do they, if they want Dr. Drew, they'll probably watch Dr. Drew on Dr. Drew's show. And so that's where I think there's a formula with guests of getting somebody that people haven't seen directly, or they can't really talk to directly as easily. And Carol Baskin would probably fit into that category, where she was featured in Tiger King, and she does have a YouTube channel where she just reads off her diary every day. But people don't really have a direct contact with her. And that's where I think that's more effective. Does any of that make sense?
Absolutely. No, 100%. And I'm with you. It's really about, making sure take. And it's not just somebody who's, making the search in a way. As, I'm sure, or it's common, when an author has a new book out, they'll do steps to promote that book. And then,
sure,
maybe those interviews are unique, or the hosts have takes or unique perspectives, but maybe they don't, or some questions are repeated, or you feel like that guest just has a too overexposed. So it's find the right guest for you, that unique take and that interview for your audience. I think that's so important. Absolutely.
Yes, and it's a respect to them. And on that note, like I have a really good friend who does a show, and he gets all the names. He's friends with publicists, and he picks them up on these junkets. So quite literally, it's like, okay, I got a junket on Wednesday, and he has like 10 minutes, and he just records them all. I'm like, good for you. And that, that works well for him, because he's got kind of a late night personality where he, nice, short, quick hits. He's going to get one question in. I'm not that way. I'm a little eclectic. So I'm going to first off, I'm going to have a conversation versus an interview. And that's a significant difference to me. Interview, I've got my questions, and I go question. When I'm doing a show, I might have 20 hours of preparation, and I might have a bunch of questions written out, like 25 or something. And I wind up using one quite often. Sometimes this research is to establish a relationship with a person that they don't even know that they have. Like, absolutely. I will listen to them being interviewed right up until I interview them. So that way their voice is already in my head, and it's like I'm already talking to them.
Absolutely. No, that's such a great tip. And I think it's so important. I mean, we always, at Podbean, we always tell people, yes, it's so important. If they wrote a book, read it, that kind of thing. It also adds to the familiarity you have, not just with their work, their personality that you hope to have with them. It really does speak to that. So that's such an important aspect of stations versus interviews. Depending on what kind of podcast everybody out there has, it may be a short 15, a quick fire set of questions, a deep dive conversation where you're asking opinions and really getting into it. And maybe you start with a preset list of questions, but there's, some beautiful tangent that comes out of it, and a synergy, and people are excited and they jump in. And so it's sure that, you leave space for that if that's the style of your podcast. And I think action plays into that quite a bit. And like you were saying, Carol Baskin is a great example, because she has, and at the same time, you're not having a conversation with her. That's just her reading her diary. So it's your personality, but it's a different facet, and I want to say like access in a lot of ways as well. So that's
for sure.
Yeah, that's such an important aspect to mention, because you are getting that of who they are. You're hearing them in a conversation versus versus a TV show, else. So I think making sure that you have maybe at least a unique perspective is important and relevant to your podcast, and your podcast audience is so important as well.
Definitely. Now there's the dark side of that too, though, the flip side. Yeah. And with research, you can step into it, and I have in the past, called the curse of knowledge. Yeah. Yeah. And what this is, if I have studied very deeply on somebody, there are certain elements of them like, yeah, I know. And I might gloss over it, or I may start talking almost like it's an inside joke with that person, not stepping back to say, hey, wait a minute, Eric, audience doesn't know this. You need to include them. You need to tell them, oh, we're talking about, it's like filling in the buddy, at a party. Mm. You've got to remember that. And it's a hard call, because I do believe in being informed as possible, but there is an argument to be made to be a Larry King, who quite literally just wants to know what their name is and what their job is, and that's it. He wants nothing else. He digs it all out in the interview and conversation.
In the interview. Yeah, I think it's a real balance. And when you're getting hyper, important to remember that some of these guests, you may be the first introduction have. And it can be that, the guest has a big following and aligned your podcast and listen to that episode because of that guest and become, lifelong audience members. But it could be that you have those or listeners who have found you via a different episode, subscribe to your show and love the show. And this is their first time hearing that guest. So it is super important to make sure that that's included. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about in terms of reaching out to guests with a large reach, because it's really for a lot of podcasters.
Sure.
Out there, it can be really, I really like this person's work, or, I'm a big fan, or whatever it is. And podcasting itself has to entry that it's hard to and import professionally. So when you're approaching a lot of these names, I want to talk about the pitch now.
Sure.
That pitch, what do you include? What do you say about your show? And what have you found in terms of securing a lot of guests that have big followings within their industry?
First off, one thing about the pitch is I always write the pitch, every word of it. I don't have a template. I don't copy and I don't paste. And the reason is that even though that might be neurotic, I feel like your tone will come through when you write. And if I have something that is boilerplate or a template of some kind, it's going to not go over very well, or it won't feel right. People, they don't even know why, but it just won't ring true with them. So that's the first thing. So even though I might say the same thing over and over and over, I've had this person, I've had that person, whatever, I'm still typing it, every single word the whole time. Second, I try to put out a message to them that makes me sound like I could be fun or interesting to hang out with for a little bit.
Have a good time. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's painless. It has to really give a lot of very specific detail without being too long, to where it's no troubles. They can just boom, they can go. And when I was heavily doing the podcast, I had a booking calendar all set up too, right? So it's like I sent the booking link right there in the first email. So I didn't have to get a yes and then go back and then coordinate or anything else. I had a booking system. And I was like, see if there's a time there for you. Yeah. And you'd be surprised how often you hit them. They're curious. They click the link right there because they'll forget about it forever. Yeah. They click it and all of a sudden, boom, I would get a notice that somebody booked. Might be a 3-week-old email. I don't know. My favorite was Cheryl Atkinson, fantastic journalist, worked at CBS, independent author. I pitched her, I want to say like late spring of 2018 or something, or whatever it was, and I didn't hear anything. So that's another step, is when you put it out there, it's like throwing a stone into the into the lake. It may skip or it may just sink. Never know. But I put it out there, and then I think it was in December, all of a sudden I heard back from her months later saying, "Hey, do you still want to do this?" We got caught up on my email. I'm like, absolutely.
Wow.
And that is a lot of it. And let me see, the last point. I try to tailor it to the person. Like, I have a lot of VO people on, or have had, on podcasting. So if I say I've had the Susan Bennett, the voice of Siri, when I'm pitching a voiceover artist, well, I just have one of the biggest voiceover artists, so you're in good company here. It's name dropping.
Absolutely. No, I think the aspect, in terms of helping the guests that you're pitching familiarize themselves with your podcast, right? Do you include the number of episodes? Do you include past bigger guests, right? Or past guests that are within the same industry or within the same niche? Ad sponsors. Do you include the topic you want to talk about? These are some of our favorite episodes of the podcast. We'd love for you to have a listen. This is what the podcast is. If you'd like to have a listen, this is what it sounds like. So I think it's so important to make sure, where is relevant to pitching, you include it, right? So, hey, are you a voiceover artist? We've got the voice of Siri, and we also want you. I think it really adds to their level of understanding of your show.
Oh, yeah.
And of your specific niche as well. So that's such a great example.
And it accumulates over time. You have one, and then you have another, and you have another. And I mean, you get the first voice. My first voiceover artist was an audiobook narrator. And I happened to, listen to a lot of his books, but not well known. It was a second job for him, even though he's done over 200 books. And he's out there, but I started with him, and then I picked up other ones along the way. And as soon as you have 3, 4, whatever, it adds up. FBI agents, I don't even know how many.
Absolutely. And that's the other really important for everybody out there listening. You may not start with your top guest, right? You may not start the biggest name within your niche or with genre, but you will get there, right? It's something where these things are cumulative and they build.
Yep.
It's really an important aspect. Yeah.
It is. And also, you're not going to go for the biggest guest on the planet either. Go for the interesting guest. Go for whomever is in line with your audience. Again, it's not the big name necessarily. It's who is a good story. And sometimes that smaller name is more interesting than their bigger name, and they might even work together.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I love some of your best performing episodes aren't with the biggest names, right? And that, just circle out finding the interviews that you're most excited about that fit your genre the best. And I also really like what you said of the timeline, right? Sometimes we reach out to people like, oh, if they don't come back to me tomorrow, they're just not interested, right? But you never know what a lot of everybody in general and, high profile guests that you want to book on you don't know what their calendar looks like. You don't know, maybe, if they're thinking, oh, I'd love to do a podcast, but I just don't have the bandwidth. I don't have the personal bandwidth to sit down and time. And so it's really important to have that understanding and just integrate that and also follow up. I think that's a really great idea as well, because, you never know. Hey, just wanted to follow up. We're super excited. We'd love to have you. And, with the, sorry, I can't remember the specific name from the news. But so sorry.
No,
but you were saying, from late spring to end of the year was like, oh, I'm ready. I've booked in. I'm ready. I'm ready to do the interview. So I think it's so important to have that perspective as well. And also from a talent aspect, it's important to think about what maybe the people that you want to have on your show, what are they look, right? What's going to be exciting, going to be fun for them, and what's going to be engaging for them? It's going to make the difference or make an impact when you make your pitch. So
yes.
yeah.
Oh, just another thing, and this is post pitch, if you will, but working with a guest in terms of scheduling is very paramount. And what I have found is they may cancel on you 3 times. They may have to reschedule or rebook or change this or change that. And I have a weird theory that every interview happens when it's supposed to happen. And if you have a good attitude about it, like if the guest, for whatever reason it is, it might be they just don't feel like it that day. And it doesn't matter to you, because if you force them into an interview, it's not going to be a good interview. They're not going to be happy about being there.
Yeah, they're not going to be happy. Exactly.
But if you are like, oh, yeah, sure, no worries. Will this work for you? Will that work? And genuinely are saying, no problem, happy to help you. They are going to come into it thinking, okay, well, you're working with them. You are showing a good faith gesture here, and they're more likely to be very happy with you when you have that interview.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to be really important. That's a really important aspect that I think is overlooked. Fun is overlooked. And podcasting is fun. As podcasters, we create podcasts because we love having conversations. We love going down the road with interesting guests and, sharing stories and learning, sharing knowledge, all of that. So I think it's important to remember that podcasting is fun and it's fun for your guests. So if they're having a day where, they just don't feel like they're going to give you, first of all, thanks for telling you that. And number one, and second, I think remembering that flexibility and bringing a little bit of that lighthearted aspect of it is super important. And you talk about production schedules and, batching so that, you can have that flexibility and that you can afford to, not say, oh, everything's hinging, but to have a little bit of leeway in terms of your production schedule. So that if maybe you have your 4 already in the pipeline ready to go, and that is such an important and from a guest perspective, you do want to come off professional. So I think, like you were saying, Eric, including that are of notoriety and have made an impact in the industry, including maybe some of your bigger episodes or your favorite episodes, including you can also include numbered. Also, some podcasts include episode like download, how many episodes they've produced, or things like that as well. So it can be, it all adds up.
That's tricky. That gets tricky with the numbers, because there are some guests who are very numbers oriented, and in general, I have a rule about that, and it's essentially, if I pitch somebody and they ask for my numbers, I'll give them my numbers because I pitched them. I have people reaching out to me, and I'll be like, yeah, you know what? They might be all right. And then they go, what are your numbers? They'll never get my numbers. Just on principle. So
so they reach out to you saying, I want to be a guest. And then they ask for your numbers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there is an etiquette there. Absolutely. There definitely is an etiquette there. And I think, if you're pitching as a guest, this is also a really important point. If you're pitching a show as a guest, you're asking to be featured, right? So you're saying, hey, I really like your show, I'm part of the community, or I have something important to share with your audience. And then to go back, what are the specifics? I think that threshold when you pitched yourself. So that is an important aspect for anybody out there who is looking to be a guest on a podcast. It's super important to do your research on the front end. Check out where if they're ranked, check out where they are with specific genre, check out past episodes, do your research on a podcast to make sure that it goes both ways. You make that personal effort as well. Say, hey, here's my bio, but here's why I'd be a good fit. So I think that door definitely swings both ways. 100.
Yeah. And 100%. Listen notes is a good place. If you want to look at a podcast and kind of just get a general vibe of where they might be, check out listen notes, and you can kind of go, oh, top 1.5%, top 5%, and that'll kind of give you an idea. I think there's 4 million podcasts, so
there's a lot of podcasts. There are, and we host so many of Podbean, 600,000, over 600,000. So it's definitely a wonderful world of podcasts, and that's why we're having these conversations, because the industry itself is growing at such a rapid to be successful in their podcasting endeavors, and guesting is such a big aspect of that. And as podcast is growing, people are starting to understand what works, what doesn't work, what's going to get results. And like you were saying, Eric, I mean, a lot of podcasters are surprised that sometimes your biggest episode isn't your biggest name. The most downloads isn't coming from a famous person who has the biggest following that you've ever had on your show. And that is an important thing to remember. And I also want to talk about, in terms of reaching out to potential guests on our shows. What would you say are some best practices that you've used getting their contact? Because for a lot of people that can feel a little bit daunting. The person's well known, the person, maybe he doesn't have an email publicly listed on their website.
Sure.
What has been your process for that?
For a while, I was doing it a lot on LinkedIn, actually.
Oh,
You'd be surprised how effective LinkedIn is just for finding the people and getting a message to them. And I would, I would ask for a link with the pitch in the link. But again, I would write the pitch out very specifically. By the way, this is a word of the wise of everyone. Please. I'm pretty cool about Facebook or anything else. When you reach out, don't just say hello. You say hello. I don't know.
Yeah.
I need to know a context. So I treat everyone in that manner. Like if I reach out on LinkedIn or even Facebook or Twitter, it is hi, I'm who I am. This is what I'm about and why I want you. And very clear messaging, very to the point. And what's nice is on LinkedIn, I think you only get a couple hundred characters on that initial burst too. So it's going to teach you a little discipline.
You have to keep it.
And so it's like, like if I'm reaching out to an FBI agent, I've had over 10 FBI agents, including Robin Drake or whatever, throw a name in there. You check this, check me out here, and the link to the show, blah, 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 blah. I have, and by the way, you could say you have a bunch of episodes. I have over 200 episodes, or, there's a lot of different ways to go. Start with your strongest point. Like if somebody asks you numbers, maybe your episode numbers aren't great. So go with your monthly numbers. Yeah. I get X number downloads a month. Yeah. Well, I have 100 episodes. And so that's a lot more downloads than necessarily an episode.
And I think it is about, right. And, also I do have to say in terms of monthly, is a number that advertisers look at even. It is definitely a number that people do consider and is important. But I think it's forward, right? Whether it's number of episodes, whether it's monthly downloads, whether it's their guests of notoriety, but you want to make sure that you put forward and you say, hey, we're a great show, whatever your show is, and that you're really active, getting them as excited about your show and the interview you want to have with them as you are.
Another approach too is like, let's say you don't have a big guest. What if you're trying to get the first guest? That's a tough one for folks. It's like, I don't have the big name. So first off, don't go for the big name necessarily. Yeah. Go for attainable names who are trying to build it out. But if you want to reach a little higher, do a little bit of work, do something to make them curious. Like read an article that they are in. And when you read it, speculate about things. Think of a question that you have that's not addressed in there that may strike them like, I never thought of that. So start a conversation with them. Like, I would like to have you on to discuss what happened with this very specific thing that they seem passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another important aspect of making sure that you're providing value as the guest is providing value by, taking the time to come on your show, if they are a guest of note, like we're talking about how to book a celebrity, right? Like you've had celebrities on your podcast, they're bringing that name to your podcast. So in turn, what are you going to bring? You're going to bring insightful questions. You're going to bring a fun experience. You're going to bring an easy way to book in, do the interview, no hassles. You're going to bring flexibility and understanding, right? Important to remember, like we were saying, that door swings both ways. So it's important to remember, like, the guests that you want to have, how amazing for them as well. I love that. And I think LinkedIn is such a great one, especially specifically for your podcast, but overall in general, if a podcast that maybe has professional guests, maybe has guests, are within a specific industry, that kind of thing, LinkedIn can be a tremendous resource. And I think over other platforms, people are generally more inclined to respond via LinkedIn because it's professional.
It's a mindset. You are supposed to be conducting business on this platform. Right. Whereas some of them might be saying, I'm only on Facebook to share pictures with my family. I feel like you're cutting into my family time, or Instagram or things like that. So LinkedIn, it's kind of like, just because of where you are, it feels a little bit better. I mean, obviously an email is your best.
Yeah.
Hands down, because that is to their inbox at their leisure, whatever. Don't always have that. That's where I'm like, go see if they're on LinkedIn. You never know. Yeah. Google around for an email address, whatever.
Absolutely. I mean, check out their website. Sometimes even have a website in the bottom corner or on another, they'll have another page of their website. You have to dig. Or it'll be within a link on a social media post, but it's important to research to find the closest contact. I agree with you. I think email is best. It comes in professional. You can state your case, get within your own parameters. There's not a character limit. And I think LinkedIn is also phenomenal because, like you said, people go in with the mindset that it's business and professional networking, in terms of your media strategy or within the specific industry niche is in, you can address those guests head on, which I think is super important. I also wanted to using your connections, because that's a really important one. And we touched on this a little bit, right? Because if you have a guest of notoriety, voice of Siri, right? If you guest of notoriety and that guest is recognizable to a guest that you're pitching, that's already using your connection. Right? Maybe they've heard of them. Maybe they know them. Maybe
I could talk about how I got Siri.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all connections. Siri works with another guy, Randall Kenneth Jones, who wrote a really cool book, is a fun, engaging, amazing personality. I invited him onto the show. That led into the relationship. And then she came on the show. So quite often, if you can't go directly, go to somebody they work with. They're going to be a great guest too.
Yeah.
Also, please keep this in mind, folks. Believe it or not, the biggest names are the least likely to share or do anything. The people who are trying to get the word out there, if you do a good job, they will help share it out. They will be proud to have been on this show and will work with you. So sometimes you might have somebody who has 5,000 followers or 1,000 or whatever it is. But you'd be like, God, they get a lot of people in here to watch or a lot of people in here to listen because they care. And I would much rather have a low profile person who cares a lot, have an outstanding show, have everybody enjoy the experience. And by the way, that person, they're on their way up. If they've got that attitude, they're on their way up. So now all of a sudden you're planting a seed. In 3 years, people may be going to your podcast because this person just landed a giant break on a television series, or they just landed a major gig, or they became high profile. You don't know who they are, but they're coming. And anybody who's working with you in that manner or has that kind of attitude, they're not going to be failing. They're going to be somebody amazing. Just watch them.
Absolutely. No, and you said a couple of things there that were just so important. But I want to start with that one. In terms of leveraging the impact of your guests, right? Because while we have guests because we want to have amazing conversations and, we love creating shows and content and all that as podcasters, it's something where, those high profile guests, the assumption is they're going to get me more listeners. And sometimes they do, right? People see the name, they recognize it, they listen to the episode, or they find your podcast through a high profile guest. And it is important to recognize that sometimes those guests that may not have as big followings yet, or maybe even ever, may have more direct followings, may put in the effort, may share social graphics, may, send out a press release, may say, hey, I would love to do your podcast, and here's how I'm going to help promote, right? And offer that in exchange. It's something where, sometimes those larger guests, they don't need to do anything, right? Like, they don't need to share. They're already, established within their industry, within their career. So they're not necessarily motivated to share the podcast that you've gone out and them and planned the interview and done the interview and edited and uploaded and created specific custom graphics for and all that work on. They may just interview, and that's great because that's where they are in their career. But for some of those guests that maybe are on their way up, like you're saying, they're going to be so excited that they're going to want to share. So they're going to send out email invites. They're going to, share and tweet. And so it's really important to recognition as well, because that impact isn't, exposure isn't singular. Not like, oh, this person's famous, so this is automatically going to get more downloads, because the impact of people who are maybe on their way up or who are going to put in more of it. So no matter what their footprint is or their impact is overall in their career, they're going to help your episode have a bigger impact as well.
Yeah. And you'd be surprised too. Like, a lot of times the bigger name or whatever you will, they have a circle of friends.
Yeah.
And they may be watching you do a show with one of their friends who's lesser known because they're excited that their friend is getting that exposure.
Yeah.
So a lot of these things are happening in the background. You don't even know it. And it's a weird thing over time that you'll start to see, but I keep running into people who know me and I didn't know that they knew me. And it's a little disconcerting. It's a compliment. It's wonderful, but it's also like, you know who I am? Really? And they'd be like, yeah, you had such and such on, or I have, and I'm like, oh, you actually watched the show or you listened to a show? Oh my God. Yeah. And you would be surprised. You would be very surprised. Also, leverage other podcasters. Good God, we're a community. One of the best things I ever did is in 2018, within, I don't know, my show is 4 months old. I went to Podcast Movement in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And while I was there, I got to meet podcasters I'm still friends with to this day.
Yeah.
From around the world. And we share ideas and misery and tears and joy and all this stuff. But also while you're there, I talked to somebody who was with, I believe it's Edge Studios, a voiceover group, and just talking to him. I had a great conversation, wound up having him on the show. And then he actually listened to it and then gave me a spot check saying, okay, you're good at this, you're bad at that, you're good at this, you're bad at that, on how to do it. And this guy runs literally like all the voice people in New York. So really, really high level folks. David Goldberg, I think his name was. I have a bad memory. But that relationship that's there, or you talk to these other podcasters and they'll be like, you had such and such on your show 2 years ago or a year ago. Do you think they'd be a good fit? Are they open to it? I mean, could you see if they're out there trying to get around, or when you have a guest on and they're looking to come on other shows, can keep me in mind if you think I'd be a good fit? It's immeasurably helpful because a lot of times podcasters are hearing from the guest or their people, hey, I'd like to go on other shows. I've got a book coming out next month, or I'm about to go on a tour in 6 months. and they'll say, I don't know, we talked to Bill, Heather, and yeah, they'd be pretty good. Boom.
Absolutely. And first of all, I just want to say we will be at Podcast Movement. We have a big booth. Come say hi to everybody out there who is going to be at Podcast Movement in 2022 in Dallas. Check us out there. And you know, podcasting is such a big community. It's so important. So whether you're networking from guest to guest or from podcaster to guest, you're really it's about establishing those one-on-one connections, and that creates that network. And so it's so important, like you were saying, and you never know who's listening. So that's why making sure that you're presenting, you know, and doing the research and putting forth the interview that you, whether the guest has, you know, 100 Twitter 1,000. It's something that you want to make sure your content is consistent and you're showing up like you've got the 100,000 or 1 million follower guests, because friends with a lot of people coming up there, you know, and you never know who's listening. And so I think that's such an important aspect in terms of using your connections and networking, like you were saying, because, you know, whether it's you have a guest on and you love that guest, or the guest is, you know, within a specific voiceover, because that's what we've been going. And then from there,
Sure.
you know, you build up your repertoire and your library of episodes of amazing voiceover artists, or whether you're at a con with podcasters who are like-minded or who have shows within your niche or a similar, and you can create your community from there. So important, like you were saying, to just make sure that you remember podcasting is a community. Absolutely.
And by the way, at that conference, I interviewed 2 people from Podbean.
Oh, well, there you go.
Let you know. I also interviewed, well, and here you go. I interviewed Mike Mignano at that same conference, who was the CEO of Anchor before it got picked up by Spotify. And that interview did extremely well later, because who knew that months later, suddenly Spotify was going to buy Anchor, and I had this exclusive interview with a guy who was controversial at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, with podcasting, you know, if you have evergreen content, if you're doing deep dive interviews, like your content's evergreen. So if you have a guest that maybe everybody wants to know about later, they're going to come back to your episode, and they're going to. And so I think it is really important to remember that. And you're planning your interviews, when you're approaching guests, whether they are the biggest high profile guests at the top of your wish list, who you think is really interesting and you want to have a great time and a great conversation, and you know your audience will love them. It's important to remember that content lives on, and you know, at Podbean monetize that content forever with new ads, which is fantastic. Something where when you're doing the interview, when you're guest, you know, you don't know what that guest is going to do for the rest of their life, and they may, you know, their moment in the sun, or everybody wants to know their name, or there's a big, and when they look you up, they look up that guest, they're going to find your show. So it is really fun as well. And I wanted to just
have one more example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Real quickly, but I interviewed John McAfee when he was on the run from authorities.
Yeah.
And he died last year in his cell in Spain.
Yeah.
My interview footage is supposed to be in the upcoming Netflix series on John McAfee. Because I happen, so you never know. It could be the next big thing, or they may not be here tomorrow, and you might be one of the last interviews they ever had in a particular period of time. So I just want to throw that in there as possible.
No, and that's, I do have a couple of more minutes. I do want to just quickly, I have a couple more quick fire questions at the end, but before we get into that, I think it is important to remember that there's different ways that your audience is going to watch, right? And there's different ways that your guest is going to share. And so maybe you make sure you have that video footage that you may want later, or you're going to utilize later to have it. And then also, your guest has a big YouTube. Your guest will share the podcast episode, but they'll also share that you provide them with those. That's such an important aspect as well. And like we're saying, you know, sometimes it's the high profile guest and sometimes it's not, but making sure that you provide them with all of that content, make it as easy for them as possible is really important, easy and fun. Well, I just want to ask you a couple of fun ones. So what have been your absolute favorite guests, not to choose your favorites, but guests that you've had on the show that you've really enjoyed?
One of my all-time favorite guests is, as I put her, an adult female entertainer. And
wow.
I mean, it's very, very controversial, but it was just, she's so funny, has zero filters. And it was like, if I was drinking, it would be, just spit taking the entire interview. I was just dying laughing. And it was Jocelyn Stone. And we talked about adult content, but it wasn't in a salacious way. It was just kind of the lifestyle, and knowing her as a person who was just amazingly funny, super funny episode. And that goes that's way back toward the beginning, but
the catalog,
but it really is a thrill. Now, my other favorites, I do a ton on YouTube, really. And, I kind of have a roster of people like the Behavior Panel, who are all my friends now, and or a Legal Panel every other Friday. And I love those because we just have fun. I mean, they're completely fun in the sense of, I do zero preparation. I just show up, and what are we talking about?
Yeah.
So I don't know. And there are a lot of them, but as far as just interviews go, she has to rank way up there. I had another interview I'm very proud of, and it was a funny interview because of what happened. Chris Voss, who people might know, he has a master class. He wrote Never Split the Difference. Very important negotiator, FBI guy. I did the interview with him. We had great chemistry to start, but we had bad technical issues. And by the way, having a good service like a Squadcast or a Riverside can be very beneficial, because I was depending on the service and we were double ending. And I had no idea if he was finishing a sentence or what. So I was actually making it up as I went without really knowing what his answer was going to be necessarily, and just catching words here or there for about 15 minutes in that interview.
Wow.
And it came off, but it came off great. And so that one I kind of love, just because of
something to be proud of. Yeah. Exactly. It's one of those things where you're just on the go and you kind of have to hope that it works out. But the fact that it did, that's pretty fun. Really fantastic. Well, yeah, pleasure. I think we've gone over so much of getting high profile guests, what they're looking for, how to make the pitch, how to find their contact, how to be a good guest. And when you want to be a guest on a podcast, do outreach, leveraging guest impact in terms of social media, networks, all of that. And, hearing about what you've been doing at Unstructured, and just such a treat. And today, do you have any exciting guests coming up for you? Is there any exciting Unstructured side?
God, my mind literally just emptied. On YouTube, I have Spidey coming back this week of Behavioral Arts. That'll be fantastic. As far as guests go, I'm doing things on YouTube first and then putting them on podcast later. Yeah. So Spidey's the first thing coming up. I'm doing a lot of stuff on the Manson stuff and Depp and Gore, but yes, Spidey Behavioral Arts, fun. He's a good friend.
Pretty cool. Oh yeah, we'll have that as well here in the of our live stream today. Everybody who wants to check out Eric and Unstructured will also have the link to your podcast so that people can have a listen and check out some of your favorite episodes, notable guests, all of that good stuff. And thank you so much for speaking with us today about how to book a celebrity on your podcast, how to get those big impact, what that experience is like, from your experience with Unstructured. I'm going to read our brief outro conclude today. So thank you everyone for joining us at Podcasting Smarter and our August live event, How to Be on Your Podcast with Eric Hunley, the host and creator of the Unstructured podcast, as wings and how to get those high value guests. For those of you who may have joined us for the Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions just like this one with top podcasters and experts, and we have all of our episodes that are live recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast with tips and best practices. If you join late or want to have another listen to this conversation, you can replay on the podcast or on Podbean's YouTube. Podcasting Smarter is brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to podcasts. To start your podcast today, head over to podbean.com. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for next month's How to Make a Podcast Ad. And
thank you.